Hi, my name is David Ward, and I'd like to welcome you to my first ever recorded video in service. Today we'll be talking about reading in the alternative setting and how read alouds can be used to address the social and emotional needs of our students. Before we dive into the literature portion of today's activities, I'd like to talk to you about a couple of factors that I think have to be in place in order for the alternative classroom to be a success. One of those is your mindset, and the second is creating a safe environment for your students to learn. When I'm talking about mindset, what I'm referring to is the way that we view ourselves in the classroom. In today's society, especially in the year that we're facing right now, there are so many factors that are out of our control. Administrative decisions, state decisions, and many other things. We cannot focus on that. What we have to focus on is that we are the last line of defense for many of our students, and we have to do everything that we can in order to glean the knowledge and build the skills that are necessary to reach these difficult students. With that said, I'd like to talk about mindset of this video. I can stand in front of a group of people and talk without any hesitation, without any real nervousness, but standing in front of a camera is very, very difficult for me. This is something that I hope that I get better at as we go through this video. I ask that you use the proper mindset and listen to what I'm trying to say instead of the ramblings and the stutterings that I may make while shooting this video. Now, another thing I'd like to address in mindset is sometimes we have those students that are difficult to reach. Students that we just literally bang our head against the wall and we don't feel like that we can get through to them. Sometimes it's easy, and when I say this, I'm speaking from personal experience, it's easy to get frustrated and almost hold a resentment toward that child. A few years ago, I was listening to a presenter and he made a comment that stuck with me, and I hope that it sticks with you when I share this with you. In his presentation, he said that when he had a student that he couldn't reach, or that had actually learned how to push his buttons, that he had the strategy of going into the classroom earlier before the kids arrived. He would sit in that child's desk and he would pray for them. He said after he had done this for a few days, that he was never able to look back at that child's desk with that child in it and feel the same sort of resentment that he had before. This is the kind of thing that I hope that we as teachers draw on and can take into our heart and into our classroom. Another factor that I would like to talk to you about is creating a safe learning environment for our students. This goes hand in hand with mindset. You see, when students come into our classroom, oftentimes they have experienced failure after failure after failure, and they've reached a point that they actually quit trying. So when they come into my classroom, what I want to do is I'm going to give them something that they can be successful at. Whatever it is, it may seem like a really simple assignment, but once they have that success, I allow them to build on that success. This helps students to gain their confidence back. Also, we take a little bit different mindset in terms of why we're doing schoolwork. So many times our kids have the strategy and mindset that they come in, that they put out a minimal effort, they turn it in, they get a grade, they move on. And in my classroom, what we work on a lot is we focus on accomplishing a task for the sake of accomplishing the task more than for, and what we're going to learn out of it, more than for the grade that we're going to receive from it. Also, when a kid comes into my classroom, I have some basic rules that I like to share with them. We sit down and we have a one-on-one conversation, and I tell the child, rule number one is I am never going to lie to you. Okay? What that means is sometimes you may ask me a question that they don't like the response to, but the reality is I'll always be honest with them. I also tell students that I will do my very best to be as kind and nurturing as I can, but at the same time that I'm going to be as strict and firm as I have to get the task accomplished. That's how much it means to me for them to be successful. When all these factors come into place, we see that the mindset of the child changes, and in time, then they become more goal-oriented. I'd like to share a story with you that happened in one of my classrooms that means a whole lot to me. I had this young man that when I first came to my classroom, he was in first grade. I would go into the regular classroom and observe him before he was accepted into my program, and I saw this little boy who would spend a majority of his time underneath his desk in the fetal position crying. It broke my heart. When he came into my classroom, it was a long process to gain his trust and to gain his confidence. In fact, I ended up having him in my class for a couple of years. One day he came into my classroom though, and he was so excited, and he says, "Mr. David," he said, "I have something in my head and I've got to make it real." Now, I could have taken on the thought, well, we have all these objectives that we have to get done today. But instead, what I did is I said, okay, if this is important to you, I want you to go over here in the corner, get what the materials that you need, and make it happen. This young man sat down and he worked feverishly for a couple of hours, coming up with a design that I'd like to share with you at this point right now. It took him several attempts to get this project to work the way that he wanted it to. But he was so proud of himself when he finished. What was the best thing about it is that the other kids in the classroom became excited about it as well. This opened the door to a lot of conversations about gravity, force, momentum, simple machines, things that I've been wanting to introduce into class anyway. What I did next is, because of the excitement that was there, I started making a challenge, and I said, okay guys, I'm going to put some criteria together, and I want you to build something more complex using this as the base. The kids went wild with this. And I think that while this necessarily doesn't have anything to do with the reading portion that we're going to talk about later, it is indicative of what happens when there is a safe environment for the kids, that if they make a mistake, they know it's not the end of the world, that they're going to keep going and they're going to persevere until they complete the project. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to show you the video of the next step that the class as a whole came up with as a result of Aiden's first project. This project brought an extreme amount of energy to my classroom. The great thing about it is not only were the kids excited, I got excited. And it's like a spiraling effect. And it snowballed. And we were able to teach numerous classes, and you go back and use this as a reference point. And the kids drew on that. And I could see the confidence of each and every one of the children increase because of an activity like this. This can translate into all kinds of lessons. We're talking about reading and reading aloud. And there's some things that I want to talk to you a little bit about before we go into deep detail about that. Some of the struggles that our children face. I watched a video the other day, and it got me to thinking about the struggles of our children before they come into our classroom. And to do that, what I'd like to do is I'd like for us to take a few minutes, and I want us to visualize something with me here if you can. Imagine if we brought in a whole group of children and lined them up like a race. And at the beginning we said, this is our children when they start school. And our race is going to be to make them good, competent readers, confident readers. And so before we start the race, I'm going to ask you some questions. And for each one of these questions, you're going to have to either step forward or step back. And you were to ask a question like, first, when your mother was carrying you before you were born, did she take care of herself? And if she did, you get to take one step forward. If your mom unfortunately used drugs or smoked or was a heavy drinker during your pregnancy, you take one step back. Then you ask a question like, as a child, before you started school, did your parent, and even during school, is your parents regularly reading to you? If you are, you get to take a step forward. If not, you stay still. What about, do you regularly see your parents read at home? And there's an emphasis on education and reading. Take a step forward. If not, you may have to take a step back. And what we see is before the child ever even comes into the school system, if you're talking about a race, they're way behind already. And if you look at that, and if you were able to do a visual of this, the kids back there in the back that have a long ways to catch up, a lot of times those are our kids. So we have to take some steps that are going to help these kids to catch up. And that's not always easy. Sometimes I have people question me why that I feel that read alouds are so important. And has been a key component that is important for children to learn to be good readers that is missing in their lives. And even if it's in 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade, if they haven't been read to, the part of the brain development is going to be a struggle for them. Recently, I've been doing some work with the science of reading, and in this science of reading, they talk about the different parts of your brain and how part of it is visual and part of it is auditory, and how that there has to be connections. When I heard that the first time, I thought back to Ken Stamatis when we did Lit Lab training years ago. And he told the story about a young man who was, I think, in 5th grade, and he was paired off with a college student, and the college student was reading to him. And all of a sudden, they told him it was time to switch sessions, that he had to go to a different area, and he says, "I'm not moving." And they said, "What do you mean?" And he says, they said, "You have to go to the next class." He says, "I'm not moving." And so when they confronted him about what's going on, he says, "For the first time in my life, I can see it in my head. And I am not moving until I know what happens next." We have the chance as educators to take a child who has even been resentful for reading and turn them into a lifelong reader. If we can do that, the impact that it's going to make on their future in all subject areas, not just school, in life in general, can be profound. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about today, is some of the steps that we can take to make that sort of thing happen. The next thing that I would like to talk to you briefly about is, how do you select the books that you read in class? To be honest, when I started planning for this presentation, I wasn't even going to include this part of it. My wife, who's helping me film this, she told me, she said, "I think that you need to address how you come up with the books that you're reading in your class." And I told her I'd just do it. After we sat and had a conversation, I realized that there was a lot more thought process going into the process of selecting books than I realized that there was. I think it all boils down, though, to knowing your students. Some of the things that I look at is, I look at my students and I say, what are their interest in? Next, I'll say, what are some of the issues that my class is struggling with? This is very important because a lot of these books that we're talking about actually focus on some of the same issues that my kids in my class are facing on a day-to-day basis. Something else that I take into consideration is the reading level of my students versus their comprehension level. I think this is extremely important, and I think that this is where a lot of times that we make mistakes as educators. I have a lot of kids that will come into my class that their actual reading level is, they're slow and behind, but at the same time, their comprehension level is extremely high. As a result, when you give them books that are on their reading level for them to read, they get frustrated and they're bored with it. I think that one of the things that we miss out on is we have to continue and we have to build the love of reading. So I'm reading a lot of times above the student's reading level, but it's hitting spot on with their comprehension level. By doing this, I'm holding their interest, I'm creating imagination, I'm making connections with books. Another thing that I take into consideration is what I can do, what connections that I can make with the book in terms of teaching across the curriculum. I love the idea of creating units with each one of my read alouds. Most of the time, when we're doing a read aloud, this is where my vocabulary that I'm teaching my students is coming from. We're teaching science, history, math, all connected to the text that we're reading. One of my favorite examples is when we read the book Hatchet. We did the geography of where the young man was flying from and going to, what part of the world it's in. As they introduced animals into the books, we did science units on each one of those animals, and we had long discussions about the habitats that they lived in and what Brian was going through to survive. At one point in the book, Brian talks about how that he got really good at shooting a bow and arrow, and that the ratio that of kills that he was making, so many arrows it took to kill, to make so many kills. And it just opened the doors for us to sit and have conversations about ratios, and the kids saw that it was real numbers and it had a real application into the world. When you're able to do that, you're not only strengthening the imagination and the reading ability, the vocabulary, comprehension, you're also opening the door to an avenue to teach the other subject areas that is interesting and relevant to the students. Okay, at this point, what I would like to do is I'd like to share a list of books that I've put together that I have personally used in my class and had great success with. The first book that I want to share is a little bit different than the others for various reasons. But the book is Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls. And to demonstrate what I mean about how a book can have impact, I'd like to read a short passage to you from the book and then tell you how it has personally impacted me. So bear with me as I read this to you. When hunting season opened that fall, something happened that was almost more than I could stand. I was lying in bed one night trying to figure out a way to get some dogs when I heard the deep baying of a coonhound. I got up and opened my window. It came again. The deep voice rang loud and clear in the frosty night. Now and then I could hear the hunter whooping to him. The hound hunted all night. He quit when the rooster started crowing at daybreak. The hunter and the hound weren't the only ones awake that night. I stayed up and listened to them until the last tones of the hound's voice died away in the daylight hours. That morning, I was determined to have some hounds. I went to my mama. This time, I tried bribery. I told her that if she'd get me a hunting dog, I'd save the money that I'd earned from the furs, and I'd buy her a new dress and a box full of pretty hats. That time, I saw tears in her eyes. It made me feel all empty inside, and I cried a little too. By the time that she was through kissing me and talking to me, I was sure I didn't need any hounds at all. I couldn't stand to see my mama cry. The next night, I heard the hound again. I tried to cover my head with a pillow and it shut it out the sound. It was no use. His voice seemed to bore its way through the pillow, and it rang into my ears. I had to get up and again go to the window. I'm sure if that coon hunter had known that he was slowly killing a 10-year-old boy, that he would have to put a muzzle on his hound. Now, that reason is so important to me for a couple of different reasons. When my teacher read this to me in 4th grade, I was about the same age as the character in the book. At that point, I could read, but I wasn't a reader. But when I heard those words, something happened and something changed inside of me. It wasn't so much the fact that I was the same age as the main character, or the fact that we were living in the Ozarks like he was, or the fact that I loved dogs so much. But it was the fact that I had seen that same look in my mom and dad's eyes at different points. They worked really hard and tried to provide for us. But there was times that I knew that there was things that I wanted that they weren't able to give me, and I knew that that hurt them. At that point, something changed on the inside of me. I went from being a little boy who could read to being a reader. For those moments that Miss Garrett was reading to us in 4th grade, I became Billy Coleman. When he was happy, I was happy. When he had a victory, I felt it. When he was hurt, I felt it also. At the end of the book, I cried like a baby. At this point, 40 years later, looking back, if I read the last chapter of this book right now, I would probably break into tears and cry right here on camera. That is an extremely important thing for the kids to be emotionally invested in something. And this is the first book that I was emotionally invested in. If I, as a teacher, can give that gift to just a couple of our students along the way, it would make it all worthwhile. Fishing a Tree by Linda Hunt. This is the most recently published book on my list. It is a story about a young girl who is seen as a troubled child, even though in reality she's dyslexic. Even though she's extremely gifted in some areas, she has given up on the education process. This book had a huge impact on my kids. Not only did they connect with the characters and her struggles, but they also saw the connection between academic and behavioral issues. I have to say, as a teacher, I was even impacted by this book because I could see the different roles and the different ways that individual teachers impacted this child throughout her education. Some of them for a positive way, some of them in a negative way. In my opinion, every teacher should read this book before school starts this year. Okay, the next book is Gossamer by Lois Lowry. This is a beautiful story about the power of dreams and nightmares. In this book, we see the struggle of a young boy who is placed in foster care. One of the great things about this book is that we also see the impact that his issues are having on his mother and his foster parent. This was a great tool to use with my kids to encourage them to look at issues from different perspectives instead of just through their own lens. Freak the Mighty is a book written by Rodman Philbrick. This is a great story about two young boys who were misfits, but when they found each other, they also found their voice and courage to go out into the world. This was a wonderful story that had so many life lessons in it. One of them that I used is on training about synergizing, which we use in our Leader in Me program. Another thing an issue that it handled wonderfully was how to handle loss. And probably the most important lesson, though, that came out of this book was the fact that we have the ability to shape our own futures regardless of the actions and decisions of our parents. This was something that was extremely important and extremely powerful for my students to grasp onto. All right, the next book, Wonder, is a book that probably doesn't need any introduction. I'm sure that most of us have heard of this. It's been very popular and there's even been a movie made about it. One thing that I want to point out when I mention the movies is it's always good to read the book first. I tell my students on a regular basis the movie is never as good as the book, and this is certainly the case with Wonder. This is about a young man who has birth defects that has made him stand out and has a true struggle making it in the regular world. He faces a lot of ridicule and bullying, to be honest. But we also see that there are kids that step up and do the right thing and make him feel welcome. This has some great perspectives in it. Also, one of the things that I loved about this book is that it did similar to our other books that we talked about in the fact that it tells the same story from different perspectives. As a teacher, my heart swelled the first time that one of my kids said, "Oh, wait a second," and they made a text-to-text connection between a book like this and Gossamer, where we're looking at things from different perspectives. I would also encourage you, if you haven't read the extended version of Wonder with Julian's story, that is a great read, and it's really important to kids who have themselves been bullies. So I would encourage reading that as well. The next book is Pink and Safe by Patricia Polacco. Patricia Polacco is one of my all-time favorite authors. She has some of the greatest illustrated books that children can read. In this book in particular, it's about a Civil War story of two young men whose paths cross during the Civil War. They have very different backgrounds, but they have a lot in common as well. It addresses the issues of stereotypical views. It also deals with sacrifices and learning how to face our own fears. I would highly recommend any of Patricia Polacco's books, and one of the things that I love the most is being able to tell my kids that Patricia Polacco herself was a struggling reader who suffered from dyslexia, and it seems like that's an empowering connection for them as well. All right, Tuck Everlasting is a book that my wife and I disagree on. I actually love the book, and she does as well, but we have this conversation a lot about the movies and the books, as we mentioned earlier. Melissa, my wife, actually says that this is one of the few books, probably the only book that she's ever read, that the movie was better than the book. To be perfectly honest, I love the book so much I've never even watched the movie, so I can't even answer that. It challenged my kids in a lot of ways. It asked some deep questions that we had some great conversations about. Questions like, if I could, would I want to live forever? Or the question, is doing something wrong for the right reason ever okay? A lot of times when we would get to the certain points in this book, we would stop and my kids would just sit and have open conversations for 10 to 15 minutes. And in this time, it was apparent to me that inadvertently, the kids started switching over from talking about the issues of the book to their own issues that they're dealing with in their lives. It gave them an easy format to do that, and I thought the book was powerful for that reason. Number of the Stars by Lois Lowry is a wonderful historical story about the struggles of World War II. In this book, we see a young girl who is faced with many challenges. Of those is facing her own fears and confronting her own worries and insecurities. One of the things we also see is that many times being able to stand up for what is right can make a huge difference in the world and as well as individuals' lives. Touching Spirit Bear is a book about a teenage boy who has become violent and as a result has got into legal troubles. As part of his punishment, he is actually involved in what's called circle justice, where he has to learn to deal with his issues at hand. To do this, he's placed on an island and is secluded for a year. In this book, what we see is that the actions that's taken place and the events that have taken place in his life as a younger child built up inside of him, and then it caused an anger that had come out in a violent form. What the character realizes in the book is that the only way that he's ever going to come to find peace is if he can come to terms with his own anger. The Bridge to Terabithia. This book is a real tearjerker. I've often joked and laughed that if the kids learn nothing else from this book, they learned that by me reading it to them, that it's okay for a grown man to cry. I have yet to cover this book that I don't just break down. It's a wonderful story about the importance of friendship and also about the power of imagination. Pictures of Hollis Woods is one of those books that gave my class a great aha moment. It's a story about a young girl who is in the foster care system, and she's shuffled from home to home to home. It seems like that every time that she's on the verge of being really happy, something bad happens, a lot of times because of her actions. One of the reasons I said it was an aha moment is we had just read about one of her placements that had gone bad. And one of my fourth graders, he blurted out, he said, "I understand this perfectly." He said, "Sometimes we just get to feeling so bad about ourselves that we don't feel like that we deserve anything good to happen to us." At that point, it was a huge breakthrough for that young man, and it's something that could potentially help change his entire life. Okay, A Wrinkle in Time is another one of those books that has been made into a movie, but please do not watch the movie until you have read this book. This book is a basic story of good versus evil, light versus darkness. We see the story of these three young kids, a brother, a sister, and their friend, who are traveling through time and space to try to rescue the two kids' father, who has been captured by darkness, a darkness that is trying to take over all existence. What we see happening in one part of this book that was a life-changing moment, one of my all-time favorite teaching moments, was at one point the father jumped through time and space with two of the kids and he left his son behind. When he did this, they jumped to another world, and the main character, Meg, was furious. She was almost frozen at one point, and as she came to herself, she struck out at her father. She said some terrible, mean things to him in the book. And I was afraid as I was reading this, because it's such a philosophical, edgy, scientific type book, that my kids weren't getting it. And all of a sudden I had one of my fifth graders speak up, and he says, "I know why that she was so cold." And I was like, "Okay, why was it?" And he said, "She was closer to the darkness than the others," it made that statement in the book. And he says, being dark on the inside makes you cold on the inside. And I thought that was a great connection. But then all of a sudden I looked over at one of my other fifth graders, and he had tears rolling down his cheeks. And I asked him, I said, "What is wrong?" And he said, "Mr. David," he says, "I do the exact same thing to you." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he says, "At home, I have all kinds of dark things happen." And he said, "Then I come here," and he said, "I take it out on you. I strike out at you." And he said, "That's not fair." When he said this, a little third grade boy was sitting there, and he says, "Well, I know why you do that." So out of curiosity, I turned to him and said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because everybody knows that no matter what he says to you, that you're still going to love him." To me, that's what the meaning of teaching is all about. This is the kind of opening and this is the kind of connection that we can make with children through read aloud books. And I strongly encourage you to follow through and to do read alouds in your own classroom. If you notice at this point, I haven't mentioned what grade levels in terms of the reading level of the book. I think that all of these stories that I have mentioned can apply to almost any age. I've even had first graders listen to these books and then having the AR test read to them could pass with almost 100% every time. Children love and need to be read to, and that's something I hope that you take away from our time together today. Well, that wraps up my book list. I'm really not sure what format that this video will be available on, but I would like to encourage you to take the time and think about some of the books that you have personally read with your students and share them in the comments with us. I feel like together that we can all learn to be better teachers. Also, as the school year starts, if there's anything that I ever can do to be of assistance to you, feel free to email me and I'll do anything that I can. I hope you have a great school year and good luck.